In this video, let's talk about how we can filter our pivot tables in a more graphical way by using something called slicers. So real quick, I'm going to generate a pivot table. We'll just grab our table of information, put it on a new worksheet. And for now, let's just say we do a count of employees by, we'll go ahead and put office in the rows. Maybe we'll go ahead and add department down here, and then we can put the ID in the values. And so a simple little table, we could maybe put department in the columns. Either one, having to decide which looks better. I'm going to put it back under rows. All right, so what is a slicer? If you have a pivot table, and I'm going to name it, let's just call it empty count. Now enter. On that pivot table analyze, we have something here called insert slicer. And basically it's going to be a little tool. So maybe we want to be able to slice on the office. We hit OK, and it's a little bit like a report filter. This is what it looks like. And when you click on Boston, all of this gets filtered down to only show Boston. If you hold down the Control key, you can select on two of them. So now I have Boston and Denver. Or you can clear the filter. Let's say I do Boston and hold down the Shift key. You can grab three continuous ones like that. You do also have this little tool called multi-select. So now I am able to turn things off, or let's say if I have everything turned off, well, you can't turn everything off. Most things turned off, then I can just click on them and turn them back on. They basically become a toggle. This thing's good for touch screens when maybe you don't have the ability for a Control key or a Shift key to select multiple things in your slicer. You can also have multiple slicers at a time. So another way to add a slicer is if you right click over in on one of these fields, you can say add as slicer. So I am going to add the department as a slicer. So I'll right click, add as slicer. So that's another way of doing it. And one more point I want to make is under Pivot Table Analyze, when we did insert slicer, you can check multiple boxes at once right here. So I'm going to hit OK, or cancel, I guess. So I'm going to clear out that filter. So now maybe I only want to see the number of people in each office in the accounting department. And so then I have that. Or again, I can select a couple at a time, or I only want to see the Boston customer. Whoops, I turned that off. Clear, Boston customer support, or Boston all of the departments. Now let's talk about formatting the slicers. So slicers are an object on your sheet that have its own ribbon. So now you have this slicer ribbon right here, and one of the things you can do is change the style of your slicer. So if you have your pivot table colored, you may want to color the slicers in a similar format. You can select with holding down the Shift key both slicers, and in this case I'll just make this orange color right here. The other thing you can do, I'm going to just click out and click this one particular slicer. Over here on the right you have, well, how many columns do you want this to be? So this one's kind of long, we have to scroll up and down. Well, we may want to make it 2 columns. I can adjust the width a little bit and move this up. Or you may want to make it 3 columns, something like that. And you can adjust the width and move this up. And then, of course, you can grab it and move it around or resize it with the resize handles. If you know you want it to be a particular size because you're trying to fit it in a particular area on a report spreadsheet, you can do that. So maybe I'll move this over and down a little bit so it looks like that. Whatever, you get the idea. The other thing you can do is, because these are objects and you have several of them, I could have a third one. In fact, we will put a third one here in a second. We can align these. So I want to align the centers of them. So now they're lined up right here, or you can align the tops, whatever, the things we've looked at with other objects like charting and stuff. I'm going to add a third slicer so I can show you another setting. I will just go to our pivot table, insert slicer, and we have a column that's just the year of hire. So I'll hit OK on that. We will unfilter it. Again, I'm going to make it the same color as our other ones. Make it a little longer. Okay, so here's something that's interesting. When I click on, let's say, year 2012 only. Notice Boston must have been our first office because in that hire year, that's the only place that we've hired for that year. Notice on this slicer, these things are a little bit lighter. I would call that grayed out, meaning you can't click on that. Or if you do, there's nobody in Chicago in the year 2012, right? So if you have 2012, these are grayed out, and notice we have nobody in accounting in the Boston area. So one of the settings for the slicer, I'm going to click on this slicer, and we have a button over here called Slicer Settings, and that is, what do you want to do if there's no data based on a selection in a particular slicer? And right now we have visually indicated items with no data, but we can make that hide those items. So now I can only choose Boston because this year's been selected. If I clear that filter, all of these things come back. If I click on 2014, notice I have 3 offices, but not all of them, because obviously there must have been 2, I think we have 5, 2 offices here that did not hire in 2014. And I could do the same thing with this slicer. We'll go to that slicer setting and go, yeah, let's hide things that have no data. We will clear this filter. With this filter is cleared. So now if I choose, well, no, not Boston. Let's choose Denver. And all of a sudden 12 and 13 disappeared because we didn't hire anybody in those 2 years for that office. Another thing I want to point out is our first 2 slicers are on fields that are physically in our pivot table, right? So we clear all of this. But notice hire year is not in our pivot table. So the point being, you can have things, a slicer where we're not displaying that data, but obviously the slicer will still work. So if we look at the total number of employees, and maybe I'll use the shift key and grab a few years, that number is changing based on the hire year, even though the hire year is not actually being displayed in our pivot table. Another kind of slicer that's kind of cool is under pivot table analyze is a timeline slicer. So remember in our data we have hire year, which is just, that's not really a date, but we do have a hire date. So coming back here, I can insert a timeline slicer, and it only comes up with the one field that actually has a date in it. And so it will look like this. You can obviously size it just like all the other slicers. And I can scoot this over so we have quite a few years. You have a choice here. Do I want to just show years or months? What are we looking at? Or months like that, going back to months. So I'll go ahead and turn off that filter. Now on this guy, I can select a particular month and again hold down the shift key, and now I have a time period. So I'm looking everything from September through May of that year. One thing to notice is this slicer doesn't affect, remember we said, hey, hide data of data that's not available. Well, this is a timeline slicer, which is a little bit different than these other slicers. So these guys don't know, for instance, why is 12, 13 even showing, because I'm only showing data from September of 16 through May of 17. And the same thing will happen. Let's say I scroll all the way over and I choose January. Well, we didn't hire anybody in January. If I shift through October, we hired only people in Boston during that time frame. But these slicers aren't hiding their data because they are 2 different kinds of slicers. So then you can hit this and turn off the filter. Now another cool thing of slicers is they can control more than one pivot table. So I'm going to select them all. If you hit Control A on your keyboard, it will select all the objects on your worksheet. And in this case, all my objects are slicers. And so now I'm using the arrow key to scoot these over. I'm going to real quickly make another pivot table. So I'm going to grab this one, Control Copy, and over here to this side, I'll hit Control Paste. My mouse just screwed up again. So let's double click and make these. So now let's do another pivot table. I'm going to switch things up a little bit. Rather than the count of ID, let's just pull that off. Let's just take an average of our eval score, and I will grab here, or I can right click up here, remember, and I can summarize values by. Let's take an average, and we will right click number format. Let's go ahead and just go with the number 2 decimal places. Maybe in this case we don't want department, we're just doing average of the eval score by Office. And let's go ahead and make one more. Control copy, control paste. Oh, I'm going to run back here, by the way, and name this one. What do we call that? It is just eval by Office. And then this one, I'm going to show you another cool trick. I'm going to take Office off here and we'll add the wages. Now, I've already done this. I'm going to ungroup this. So now, here are the wages that we see in this data, right? So it's pretty much every data, unless it's duplicated, or unless the wage is duplicated, is going to show up over here in this pivot table. So one thing that I can do is group that data, and you already kind of saw that I had it grouped already. So I'm going to take this wage data and group it. And it says, hey, your lowest value is 28,400. Your highest value is this. How do you want to group it by 10,000? And so now, and I can change these numbers, but I will leave it at what it's guessing at because I kind of like that. And now I have $10,000 increments with my wages all grouped, and it's doing an evaluation of an average of the eval score by wage group. Kind of cool. So let's go ahead and name this one. We will call it eval by wage. Enter. So now, back to the whole point, is these pivot tables can affect multiple things at once. So because, notice these numbers are changing, I only have the Boston office and that went over here. If I choose accounting, now I have 15 people. This is their average eval score, and this must be the different wage groups in the accounting department in Boston. Again, we'll turn this filter off. Let's just take a look at the accounting department across all the offices. So in that department, here's our average eval score, and here it is by wage group for that single department. Maybe we only want to see the accounting department hired in the year 2018. Anyway, you get the idea. These slicers are working with all of these. You can change these report connections. Let me demonstrate that. Select a single slicer and go to the slicer ribbon. And right here next to slicer settings is something called report connections. If I click on that, notice it has all three of my pivot tables. And here's where it becomes important that you name your pivot table something meaningful. Because if this is just pivot table 1, 2, 3, you'll get confused. You don't know, well, what is pivot table 1, 2, and 3. So notice because we copied the pivot tables to create the new ones, it automatically connected to all three of them. If I hit cancel and select this one, report connections, yeah, you can see that. If I wanted to turn off the eval by wage, and now when I'm clicking over here, this pivot table is not changing. So let's turn that back on, hit OK. One more important point. I copied this pivot table to make this one, and then I copied this one to make that one. So all of these slicers connected to it. Real quick, let's create a new pivot table from the original data. Pivot table from table arrange. Is my data not there? Okay. We're going to put it in an existing worksheet, and we will put it in sheet 1 with the rest of our pivot tables. So I'll click sheet 1. We'll just put it down here, hit OK. And we'll just hurry up and do a hire date in the row area, and we'll sum the wages right here. So it doesn't really matter at this point. I have a new pivot table. Let's just say wages by year. Okay, so now when I go to this department slicer and I go to report connections, wages by year is not automatically included. So if I click on any of these slicers, this pivot table will not move. Oh, it shows count of wages. Isn't that interesting? So anyway, this will not move unless I turn this on. So now if I click on wages by year and say this slicer will now connect to that, I'll hit OK. And all of a sudden these numbers change. If I click around this grand total is changing down here. Only for this slicer though, I would have to do it again for hire by year. So yeah, that one affects this slicer, and obviously the Chicago office, I would have to turn that on. So you got to be careful, but it's in here's, or in this report connection is where you turn on or off which reports or which pivot tables the slicer affects. One more cool thing, I am going to select one, Control A, select them all, Control X, cut them out, put them on a brand new sheet, Control Paste. So now I have all the slicers over here, and they will still affect this information. So I will turn everything on, and when you go to sheet 1, you'll see all of the offices. So now let's just look at Boston. So I will only click on the Boston office, go back to sheet 1, and notice this is only Boston, this is Boston, and of course it's a little harder to tell, but these numbers reflect the Boston office. So where we're heading with this is a lot of times we'll do dashboards where we create charts and other information on a report sheet based off pivot tables on another sheet, and your user can click around through the slicers and see the impact on charts and other tables that you've set up on that report. So that is everything you need to know about slicers. They're a pretty cool tool, and especially for creating a nice visual presentation so that your user can click around on the data without having to actually click on the filters in the pivot tables.